Hello, and everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, which is Cultural Considerations for Supporting Impaired Driving Enforcement in Tribal Communities. First of all, I would like to thank Intoximeters for their support of today's webinar. Before we get started, I have a couple of items to cover. We are recording today's webinar, and we'll send you a link to the recorded webinar tomorrow in case you would like to revisit any of the discussion we have here today. All attendees are muted, but you can ask questions of the presenters at any time during the presentation by using the Q&A box on your screen. The speakers will answer audience questions once they are done with their initial discussions. You can also change your view of the speakers by using the view menu at the top right of your screen. Since today's webinar features moderated discussions, I recommend using the gallery view so you can see all of the speakers. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to today's moderator, Rob Duckworth.
Thanks, Amity. It's great to be here with you. We're going to do a different way of doing a webinar today, and we're going to do this much in a discussion form, similar type of a podcast or a webcast with open conversation and open dialogue, talking about how we can become more educated and better enabled to work with some of our tribal partners and do that effectively. This topic became very interesting to me over the many travels last year. I think we saw 35 or 36 states last year. And ironically, Judge Martin and I were introduced to each other in the far reaches of Alaska. Was our first time to have a conversation. But it was very striking to me, the knowledge of our two panelists today when it comes to the want to work with highway safety offices and help educate and create some pathways for success. So we'll talk a little bit later about some tribal entities that have instituted some oral fluid screening within their areas. But first, we want to set kind of the legal framework from the beginning here and get an introduction from Judge Martin and a little background. And we're all very familiar in the highway safety arena with judicial outreach liaisons, or JOLs. And Judge Martin, you're working in a similar capacity to that, working through the ABA. Is that correct?
That's right. I'm the American Bar Association's Tribal Court Fellow.
And so we know the JOLs work to educate judges within their region areas. What are some of the pieces that were interesting to you when coming into this role? Of being a fellow you have a different past experience than what some of our traditionalized or westernized judges and courts would remember.
Well, let me say hi, Rob, and thank you so much for having me on your podcast. And let me say hello to everybody out there. I just have a couple of preliminary statements. One is I'm here today on my own personal time, and nothing that I say should be considered to be policy or position of any government agency. Secondly, I'm going to use the words Indian and Indians in our conversation, and I just want to note that academically that's frowned upon, but in the real world, I mean, the federal government has an entire chapter of laws in the United States Code entitled Indians. And some tribal nations have the word Indians in their very name. For example, to take one example, the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians. So it's just difficult to tiptoe around, and noting its disapproval, I'll use it today. And you're right, I do come at this important highway safety work from a different background. I'm a retired tribal court judge, and I worked for the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians for many, many years. And following that, began serving as the American Bar Association's Tribal Courts Fellow, where my task is outreach to the federal federally recognized Indian tribes on issues of traffic safety and, in particular, impaired driving.
Great. Yeah. I appreciate you backing us up a little bit and giving us that full perspective of those pieces in your past experience. So when it comes to the differences or challenges when presenting evidence or collection of evidence or how courts may accept evidence, I think there was some pathways there that you had talked about to educate us on, largely around jurisdiction.
So tribal courts, Indian tribes are extra constitutional in nature. They were here before the Constitution was created, and the Constitution really wasn't created with the idea that they would be within it. But as the American experiment grew very, very rapidly, they became inside the constitutional framework, and courts have really struggled with how they fit within that framework. And so it goes from that large concept to concepts like how do you put on evidence in a particular tribal court, because all tribal courts are different. Some are very familiar to Western eyes, and some are very, very traditional. And that's kind of the general background. We can talk more about the specifics if you have more, if you want to drill down into the more nitty gritty.
Sure. I'm going to have Amity prep our poll question for our educational survey today. And the question is, how many federally recognized tribes are there in the United States? So we'll ask the participants to please enter your thoughts on how many federally recognized tribes are there in the United States. And then we'll come back and talk a little bit about those settings.
No peeking on Google.
All right. And the survey says our group seems to have done fairly well when you look at the correct number being 574, and the majority of our attendees today identified that as the correct number. So a little bit of applause to our group for having that knowledge and information of how broad the tribal communities are across the U.S. So when we were prepping for this area, we talked a little bit about some added federal tribes in Virginia, and then how those courts are then set up.
So there are some new tribes in Virginia. They were initially recognized by the state of Virginia, and in the last 5 years or so, they have become federally recognized as well. And so they're in the process of organizing and creating at least one, creating a new tribal court. So it's very exciting to see. We have in North Carolina the Lumbee tribe. The current administration is publicly stated that it's interested in the Lumbee tribe being federally recognized. So there's ongoing efforts by numerous tribes to obtain recognition.
And another item that I found interesting as we chatted prepping for this was we talked about one of the tribal courts that's over 100 years old in setup and has been operating.
Well, close to 100 years old. Navajo Nation, and by that I mean 100 years of consecutive operation. The Cherokees began operating their tribal court in Georgia, North Carolina, and Tennessee in the early 1820s. So the concept of a tribal court really goes back to about 1820. But the Navajos have been running their court since the 1930s. That's a very traditional court, but they have some very interesting aspects to it. They have their own bar exam, for example. Other tribal courts, you just have to be a member of a state court to be able to appear in that court. And we don't know, Rob, the government doesn't really know how many tribal courts there are. As of 2014, we think there's about 204, but they've had difficulty polling in Alaska and determining how many courts there are up there, and don't really have a full picture, even today in the 21st century.
Yeah, it was quite interesting because we were in Alaska when we met, and then you look at the landmass of Alaska, you don't take it in full perspective, and then you see that it fully covers the area of Texas into Mississippi and Nebraska, and multiple states. Even in the continental U.S., we think of how large Texas is, and it's really small in comparison to the landmass working there in Alaska. We want to talk about a couple of best practices or some things that you've seen. And we were talking about some joint jurisdictions and some travel pieces. And then I want to come back and talk a little bit about what the court's ability is to say what is evidence that's maybe different than we would experience in a westernized court.
So tribal courts don't have jurisdiction over non-Indian people. And you would think if you go from Georgia into Florida, you're going to be subject to the laws of Florida. But if you go from Georgia into the Miccosukee Tribe in Florida, and you're not a member, if you're not an Indian under the rubric of federal law, well, it's very possible, highly likely, you're not subject to at least criminal jurisdiction there in Miccosukee. And so you can see how this can be very daunting and confusing, particularly when you have these borderland scenarios with people living, tribe on one side, a state in the middle, and a different tribe on the other side, for example. And there are the key to overcoming that, the best practice to me is partnerships between states and tribes and building long-standing relationships as people change, tribal governments change, people leave, governor's highway safety offices sometimes change when the governor changes. So, but maintaining relationships that transcend those kinds of events is so critical. And a great example you mentioned is the idea of a joint jurisdiction court. And this was an idea of a state court judge in Minnesota who saw how far tribal members were having to drive to come to court in state court up in the middle of Minnesota. And they came up with this idea to partner with the local tribal court. And the idea being that tribal judge would convene court on video in her setting, and the state court judge would convene on video in her setting, and people, Indian and non-Indian alike, who lived on or near the reservation, could come to the tribal court, and that would count as being present in state court. It was a brilliant idea, and it's worked well and been copied and tweaked in other places where you actually have, the tribal court judge actually supervising the folks that are coming into the tribal court set. So hence the name Joint Jurisdiction Court. It's something that was organically created, but it's gotten support from lawmakers.
Excellent. Yeah, I had learned that piece when we chatted on the tribal courts being federal courts versus state courts, and to bring those two pieces together. But there's a difference there, right?
Well, some tribal courts are federal courts, and we call those CFR courts. And there's still a bunch of them. They're a holdover from the days in which the government took over organically operating tribal courts. But there are many other organically operating tribal courts, like the Navajo Nation Court, the Cherokee Nation Court in Oklahoma. Those are tribal owned and operated, so they're not federal courts. But you're correct. There are some that are actually operating under grants from the federal government, and we call those CFR courts because they get their authority from the Code of Federal Regulations.
Great. Thanks for clarifying that. I'm going through some of our notes of conversation, and this is exactly why we want to have this webinar and have this discussion. Is number one, to share the information out to the states that we have someone that's accessible, to ask these questions, and then to help us engage in different conversations. So the last item before we go to Maddie, and then we'll come back around to the panel for some other follow-up discussions, is state law. They define impairment. They define substances that can be collected and used to determine impairment. And then for a tribal member on tribal lands under that jurisdiction, what says those courts when it comes to evidence and what can be used for bodily substances to test for impairing substances?
So it's a very interesting area. It's not all tribes have adopted a code of evidence. Some have adopted the state code of evidence, which has, the experts and relevance and all of the tests that are used for the admission of evidence. But then there's some tribes where they just don't have that. Maybe they have their own code of evidence, or they just have a traditional way of looking at the value of things that are offered. And there are some things like we know breath analysis is scientifically valid. We know blood analysis is scientifically valid, but blood analysis is super invasive, and it's just more cumbersome because if you want to have a blood draw that's worth its salt, you're probably going to want to get a warrant. That can be, when you're talking about trying to draw blood somewhere on the Crow Nation in the middle of the winter, that can be very challenging. So there may be other newer technologies, like we're going to hear about, where it's less invasive, might be more acceptable to the folks at home, and might be just as acceptable from a scientific point of view, assuming, that the prosecutor can stitch up the relevance and scientific validity to the satisfaction of the tribal court judge. I mean, but when you think about the native population in this country, these are folks they're still tribes who have ancestors' bones in museums. in North America. Drawing blood has echoes of that kind of cultural invasiveness. And so while we do know it will give you a valid result, um, there should be some consideration of that when deciding whether that's going to be part of your paradigm or not. Sometimes you got no choice. If you have bodies littering the highway in some places.
Yeah,
I hope I answered your question.
you did. You brought it all together there of, types of evidence and ways evidence is accepted in the tribal courts. And then also you bring to the point of when states can work directly with the tribal communities and we're looking at data or information, we understand that challenge now of how long that could be based on the geographical travel there to collect evidence of pieces with a impaired driving investigation. And then also the cultural consideration with the invasiveness for drawing blood versus using breath whenever available, and then oral fluid, both for screening and evidential pieces to reduce that. So thanks for being with us here today. We're going to listen to some from Maddie, and then we're going to come back together as a panel and have some discussion. So
thank you.
Hello, Maddie. How are you today?
How are you?
We're doing well. You heard our conversation there with Judge Martin, and we kind of flipped our order there a little bit, but we laid the background for the court side of things and acceptance of evidence for those side of things. So you and I have got to know each other over the last year or so, working on some projects to help assist. And I learned a lot from presenting at the National Transportation and Indian Country Conference that we were at together. And then you further continued to school me or educate me in best practices with anything. So why don't you introduce yourself to the panelists or to the attendees here on your path into working with the Miccosukee Tribe in the role of highway safety specialist?
Sure. My name is Maddie Rams. I am the Highway Safety Specialist for the Miccosukee Police Department, Miccosukee Indian Tribe of Florida, which is in the Everglades. My journey over to Miccosukee was kind of a fluke. I was working in the county police department in the legal bureau, and I wanted something different. So when the opportunity presented itself, it wasn't in highway safety. It was just working for the tribe. And when they approached me after working for the tribe for a year, if I wanted to work in highway safety, I jumped on the opportunity. I've seen, working in law enforcement for 26 years, different aspects of, traffic safety, plus personal, interactions with DUI cases. My daughter, a drunk driver hit my daughter about a month after she got her driver's license. So you can imagine that, so it kind of hit close to home. So when the opportunity arose to actually participate in traffic safety, I jumped on that opportunity. And it's nice to see how different things are working for tribal government versus working for any state or local agencies, and all the nuances that go into working with tribal government.
Yes, I remember us sharing that. And I think your daughter also followed in a little internship process in highway safety, did she not?
No, that was actually Kim Ballone's daughter.
Oh, Kim's daughter, yes.
Was the one that, my daughter's like, Mom, am I ready for it? I was like, no, not yet. Not yet.
Gotcha. Yeah, so I think that that's also what helps you be such a great educator to folks from the westernized culture to growing in a process to working with the tribal communities. And I just kind of want to start off generally of some of the items that are important for non-natives to know about tribes and tribal government when trying to open up dialogue. And then we'll talk about some of the other conversations, what you've got started already, and what you're planning to do more with the oral fluid.
Perfect. Well, when anyone would like to open up dialogue with tribal government, the key thing is do research. Every tribe is different. Every tribe has different belief systems, practices. Um, something as simple as the wardrobe that you wear when approaching a tribal member, a community member, especially in important positions like business council or in general council. Just the color of your clothes can close up a conversation. So, it's harder when you have tribes that are more traditional, like Miccosukee, where there isn't a lot of information available online that you could research, but just get an idea of where they're coming from. Just having that idea gives you more of a perspective on, were their struggles worse than everyone else's? I mean, all tribes had struggles, but how much of this struggle is still alive today, especially for smaller tribes where they haven't grown, they haven't expanded, and their belief system is still very traditional. I think that has a lot to do with it. So, key thing is research, 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 research. Try to find someone that has had some interactions with the tribe, reach out to them, because it's easier to have, I guess, kind of like a liaison to open up the dialogue, because in more traditional tribes, outsiders are outsiders. Even myself, I work for the reservation. I'm a non-native. So I'm an outsider. So I have to keep that in mind with every interaction, with every conversation, because in a forum like this, we are all highway safety in some way, shape, or form, right? So that simple comment of "we" can stop a conversation dead in its tracks, because we are not Native Americans. We do not understand the struggles. We do not understand the nuances that they had to endure during colonization, and how to, survive that and manage to thrive today. So it's simple things like that that can make or break conversations with tribal government.
Yes, that was very important that I recognized, and I didn't realize, but I was being very specific when we had some conversations about proper use of I and proper use of we, and being respectful for that part of the process. When you went to the group and the courts there to bring oral fluid screening in for impaired driving cases, you had to do some work with that. A
I
couple
did.
different visits. Can you tell us about that?
So everything on the reservation kind of goes through pieces and different, I guess, groups, you could say. So when I first came across the Setoxa at one of the conferences, I took the paperwork, I, read it, I looked at it, I said, this is fantastic. I think this has amazing applications on the reservation. So aside from what I had and what I wrote down, I had to present it first to my command staff in the police department. Brought it to their attention. Look, this, I think, has great applications. It stays away from, obviously, blood is key, right? But because there's so many traditional things linked to blood and the essence of blood and how the blood carries the spirit and how it needs to be disposed of, all those different things, this is not that route. This is, one, non-invasive, two, steers away from all those traditional taboos that are related to the blood. I think we can do this. So once I got my command staff's approval, then we went over to tribal court. And then I had to meet with the chief judge, and I had to meet with in-house counsel. We had dialogue back and forth. We had dialogue. So those were two separate meetings. Then I had a meeting with all of the judges, all tribal judges in tribal court. Each had their own perspective, their own questions that needed to be answered. Things that, I mean, us not being of that community would never have even an inkling that that was a route that, well, wow, okay. So those were like the key ones. Once that was in place, we had to go before general counsel. General counsel poses it to the community. The community has questions. Are they going to adhere to sovereignty? Are they going to, is this something that is going to be reported off of the reservation, and who's going to have access to this information, and what's going to happen to it? There were so many questions that the community posed, which we in turn had to go back, answer all of these questions, bring it once again before general counsel, give them all of the responses that they needed. And then once we had all that approval, we had to go before business council. Business council makes the final decision. So it's 5 council members that weigh all of the information, weigh not only the logistical information, the community information, the financial information that goes along with it. Everything has to be weighed, and then they base their decision on that. We got our approval. We are currently in the phase of getting our SOP together on how this is going to, when it comes to DUI cases and how it's going to proceed, what the steps are going to be. We're still in the draft phase of it, because since this is new territory for us, we want to make sure that every aspect, not only police-wise, but tribal-wise, tribal court, is well represented in this SOP, and that it follows all of the guidelines, federal, traditional, local, anything that could come up is written into this SOP. So that's where we're at right now.
Excellent. So, you lay out for those that just in a traditional business process, working with a new agency to gain technology acceptance. The processes for that are not any different, and may even have some additional layers when working with the tribal partners to be able to bring a new resource into that technology. So you're finishing up the SOP, and that is for within the courts, and then also for use on roadside. Is that right?
We're going to be using it. So our highway safety officers are going to be using it on the roadsides, which the majority of DUIs are done by our traffic team, mainly because they're the ones that are squarely focused on roadway. The other officers are obviously on the roadway, but they're more on calls for different things. So we have 4 highway safety officers that will be using the SHSOs, and they will be conducting the roadsides. They will be providing, documentation. We had to come up with a document that each officer is going to have to fill out, that they will take over to tribal court when this happens. Because whenever they have a DUI and it is a community member, tribal judges get called right away. So once that happens, they'll get, they'll have the test done roadside, the documentation will be filled out, and when they're making that phone call over to tribal court, they'll have this document in hand to hand over to the tribal court judge with the receipts, with the printout from the SHSOs. So it has not only the SHSOs information, but additional information that tribal court wanted when doing these, which that in turn will be kept in a database for tribal court to access should the need arise during a hearing. This is how many times this person has been, has had this test done. This is, especially for repeat offenders, because our DUI court program is going to work hand in hand with our treatment center. So it's the program is trying to accomplish everything that is in the county government. Like if they were to get pulled out by Miami-Dade County, where they have to do the intox-a-lock and they have to do any kind of, treatment or all that we're trying to get all of those services on the reservation so that tribal members don't have to go out. Because what ends up happening is they're caught with a DUI, their license is suspended. So the reservation is about 40 minutes out of town. On top of that, the court's another 40 minutes from out, like at the outskirts of town. So here you have someone that doesn't have a driver's license, doesn't have a way to get to court. And if you don't get to court, you're in contempt of court. And there's so many other things that go with it. So what do? They get in the car and they drive. So we're trying to cut all the problems that could arise by having everything in-house. You know, we already work, our treatment facility already works with the county and local government, you know, for the DUI court program, you know, because they're having in-house counseling or, you know, residential counseling. So we're already working with the county with that. So it's just getting the certifications so that everything is done on the reservation. But again, that's a slow process because they want to make sure that all sovereignty rights are adhered to, that third-party information, what's going to happen, because they could sign an agreement that says that, yes, this isn't going to be shared or whatever, but it's not an all-encompassing. And then 10 years down the road, they're doing some kind of statistical report and using that information without the tribe's knowledge. So they want to make sure that anything that they do, everything, whether it's now, 10 years from now, 100 years from now, the tribe will have its rights preserved and adhered to.
Yeah. So I want to bring Judge Martin back into the conversation and kind of move into group discussion here. And I saw Amity put into the chat that if there's questions from the participants, please put those in there. We're moving to the part of the webinar where we want to know what questions can further be answered by the panel that we have today. And then I want to touch a little bit there on that part for sovereignty, because I know that was something that was important. And it's kind of relevant to lead into the next piece of certain groups are more economically developed or westernized than others when it comes to finances available to the tribes. And later this week, GHSA will be rolling out a new round of impaired driving grants for their state members in partnership with responsibility.org. And I know that you've been working with the Darren and his team on continuing to build these relationships. So this could be a good opportunity for highway safety officers to consider launching an oral fluid testing program, screening using oral fluid into the tribal communities and build a bridge in that process. So when we were talking about data, and that's where this becomes important for working with the highway safety officers, for them to understand a little bit about sovereignty of data and information. And I want to go to Judge Martin on that piece first, and then we'll come back around and talk about what we experienced there trying to help you with your group, Maddie. So, Judge, can you give us some background on that?
Well, Maddie alluded to this when she talked about the tribes retaining control over the information, you know, generationally. I would be interested to know if in the process of her appearing before the business committee and the tribal council, or the business council and the tribal council, if people raise the issue about genetic information being captured as a bycatch in the oral fluid swab, because the tribe would want to retain ultimate control over that, and so that information wasn't leaked out to other parties. Maddie, did that come up?
It came up, not to the extent of, you know, what are they doing with our genetic information? When it came to the oral fluids, and well, it started off with the whole blood thing. The thing with the blood is they see the blood as the essence of life, and that your spirit is tied to that. Especially, you know, the women. Miccosukee is a matriarchal society, so the essence of, you know, the spirit of the individual is captured in the blood, and there's certain religious and traditional practices that go along with anything blood related. And how it's going to be for us, like I said, for us, as long as we adhere to biohazard ways to dispose of something, we're good, right? Do we adhere to anything that has to do with, spreading contamination and all that stuff? But for tribes, it's not about that. Yes, that falls into it, but the blood has specific prayers that need to go along with it, traditional practices that go along with it. I guess the medicine man would do to this essence per se before disposing it, because you don't want to have anything happen to your spirit or anything happen to, again, their beliefs and practices that we don't, as an outsider, have information on, like specific details, but there are traditional practices and there are rituals that are done to make sure that this person's spirit isn't, hurt in any way, shape, or form because of this blood essence. The saliva, what they wanted to know was, how will it be disposed of? Is it something that's going to go into a lab and they're going to hold on to it, and 10 years down the road want to have access to it for something else? Or is it something that is going to be destroyed? Saliva doesn't have the same, I guess, value as blood does, but it does carry genetic material, like the judge said, that may be used for other things that the tribe did not agree to in the first agreement that they came upon. So those are the things that come up. How is the information going to be shared? Is it going to be shared to a third party? What is that third party going to do with the information that has been derived from the tribe? So these are the concerns. And I mean, because, and I understand where their concern comes from. A lot of times studies are done and the tribe has given authority, yes, go ahead, we're going to do this study. And because whatever agency already has that information, because they have the rights, technically, when they got that agreement, this is what, we were going to hold on to this information. But that agreement didn't state what was going to happen after if another study decided to come up and they used that information for a different study. The consent that they gave was for the original, not for anything that came up afterwards. And those are the little things that, when doing business, that, those, I guess, rights is what they want to see are going to be, protected. They want to know that if this is going to be used for this information can't be used for something else that we don't give consent to. Or to have something in place that they're aware of anything and everything that could come up, and that they have a right to say, yes, we do want to do this, or no, we don't want to do that.
Yeah. So great information. I think we've touched on a lot of different topics, but we do have some questions in the Q&A that I want to bring out. And the first one, Judge, I think this is in your purview. And the question is, what is the prevalence of DUI courts at the tribal level nationwide? Are there other types of DUI courts or specialty courts across tribal nations? And how would someone go to get the contact information to do some outreach?
Well, it's difficult to tell you exactly how many. And some courts are called DWI courts. Some courts are called healing the wellness courts, but they have fidelity to the best practices models that we know of. And then some are just sort of independent. But somebody could reach out to me and we could talk about where they're interested in looking, and we could talk about what resources are available there to look in those areas.
Great. Yeah, I know we touched on that with going back to 2014. We're still trying to get some summary pieces there with Alaska, but just learning that we have your knowledge and your experience accessible to help with this on a national level has been a great add to that piece.
I saw another question in the chat from Nevada regarding how do we get tribal police officers engaged in the uh, in this work. And my suggestion there would be to reach out to the TSRP, the Traffic Safety Resource Prosecutor in Nevada. There, I happen to know there's at least one in Carson City, and those lawyers have Indian country in their portfolio, so they will be happy to reach out to those officers and be a bridge.
Great. Maddie, you talked a little bit about the importance in building partnership, and that each tribe is different for their feelings on different things. And the question comes to if you could give one or two of the most important questions that you asked to start building the partnership, to give states just one or two things as they're trying to build and learn what to ask. So just two things there.
Well, I mean, if you can reach out to other tribes, I mean, I think the whole peer-to-peer thing is very important. There's so many tribes, and so many tribes have similar issues with, DUIs and just traffic related things that, because they vary in size and location and size in population, sometimes the smaller tribes can benefit from the bigger tribes. So just communication between tribes is key. Going to these conferences and networking with, like yourself and with other people that deal with DUIs and traffic safety. At one of the conferences, I met Judge Anchando and Judge Hoffman, and they've been vital to helping us, tribal court, and the police department figure out what steps to take next. So I think reaching out to other agencies, and if you don't have anyone that you know of that you can reach out to reach out to people like yourself who, have different contacts in different places where you can put people together so that they can have these dialogues and have these conversations, so that when you're trying to do something and you're extending, the information, that way that person, once they get to have the dialogue with whatever other agencies they want to, they know what to expect. I made the mistake early on when I started. I had this little owl. I like owls. And my daughter had given me a little owl that she had picked up in one of her vacations, and I was wearing it onto the reservation. And I didn't know that owls were taboo. This was like maybe 6 months after I started with Miccosukee. I didn't know that that was a bad omen. So, it's little things like that, which could be really bad. So reaching out to somebody that knows something about the particular tribal government that you're looking to work with is key.
Yeah, we have a piece here that I think might come between the two of you that was interesting on the question is we talked about the biological processes, and we know that impairment is impairment, and then screening or evidential level testing is secondary to show presence. And when it comes to the standardized field sobriety test that we would still use, or is there any other concerns on personal space or those different areas? And then Judge, that would go into burden of proof. And are we still at beyond a reasonable doubt in those other courts? So Judge?
Well, if we're operating under the Indian Civil Rights Act, we are with the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And Judge Heisenberg asks a great question in the chat about the how the oral fluid process is handled from an evidentiary perspective. And I know, Maddie, you haven't actually gotten a case into court, but do you understand that the validity of the testing process will still be able to be contested and fought over in the courtroom with the judge presiding and determining the appropriate evidentiary value given to the evidence?
Yes, we discussed with the in-house counsel and the administrative judge on those topics, and so the officers will be doing the Setoxa roadside, but then there's other things that will be done with the blood and the clinic. The court orders that right away, regardless of whether we did the intoxilizer or anything else. The court automatically, for the community members, once the judge has been reached over the phone during a DUI case, the judge orders blood to be drawn by the clinic.
So
So
there's a blood draw
yes,
so I understand this. In every impaired driving case in Miccosukee, there's a court-ordered blood draw.
yes, yes.
Okay.
So they're doing only for community members. Only for community members.
Well, what if it was somebody from a neighboring tribe, a Seminole tribal member?
It's the same thing. Any community member. So Seminole, Miccosukee are Seminole. So Seminole are a large group. Miccosukee broke away from Seminole, so Miccosukee is still Seminole, but they're Miccosukee because they're more traditional.
Well, let me make it harder for you. Suppose it's somebody from the Arapaho Nation.
If they're on the reservation, they'll be tested the same way as
they're going to get a blood draw.
Yes, as any other community member, because they're on the reservation or within the spaces that encompass the patrol area of the reservation.
Now, what about a non-Indian person?
Then what we would do is we pull them over. We call either FHP or Miami-Dade County Police Department, and they are the ones that would handle it because that goes straight to well, depending in the area, we encompass Collier, Broward, and Miami-Dade County. So depending on where it is that they're pulled over, it would be the agency that they would be calling, and then that agency would be designated to take them to whatever jail and whatever.
So, but it's the officer on the scene who's determining Indian status
Yes.
for the purposes of that encounter.
Yes, sir.
Okay, it's very interesting.
So I want to ask one last question and then have Amity bring us on with how to access the webinar afterwards, resources and those things. And the question is, Judge, how insulated are the tribal courts from change in tribal council leadership? You know, we experience that in the westernized culture of things change. Is there any different piece for that in the courts?
Well, wow, that's a hard question to handle. It depends on where you are, and in some places, maybe not so insulated, and maybe in others, there's a real an attempt to really adhere to separation of powers and letting the separation of powers be a bulwark for the sovereignty of the tribe. But there's a wide gradient there, and I think it can change. I think places where there is a bulwark, maybe not always, or maybe they didn't come from that place. I would say that overall, in terms of preserving tribal sovereignty, tribal courts have committed an enormous help and aid to tribal nations across this country in maintaining tribal sovereignty. And just a way everybody can take away this idea that jurisdiction is the judicial expression of sovereignty in the judicial branch.
Very good. Amity, I know you've been listening and gathering information even more than when we did our prep sessions to have discussions and information. So I know you've got some information for folks as we round out the webinar today and talking about cultural considerations and best practices towards building bridges, using oral fluid as maybe a less invasive exploratory piece when you're looking to establish probable cause before you're going to go for that warrant for making that blood draw. So we'll hand it back to you. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Rob, for leading this great conversation. Thank you to Intoximeters for supporting this webinar so that we could give it to the community. And thank you, Maddie and Judge Martin, for your time and your expertise and all of your willingness to go through our many questions. As I mentioned at the start, we have recorded this discussion, so we will be sending out an email tomorrow with a link to the recording to everyone who has attended, so you can come back and revisit it. Please, please, please. I always am curious to find out what you think of this, what you think of the topic, and whether you want to hear more. So feel free to reach out to me directly at ahart@ghsa.org to let me know what you thought of today's webinar and to give me any ideas of things you want to hear about in the future. I see a question that asks for a part 2 discussion in a few months. So that's a good start.
That's good feedback.
Thank you all for your wonderful questions as attendees and for your time, and have a great rest of your day.